record now. Okay. So we're going to pick up briefly where we kind of were Tuesday. And I put together the triangle that gives us a little, it gives us a visual of how English society was structured. And it was known as the Great Chain of Being. You remember, under God, you have the king, then the nobles who ran the society, the gentry, who ran the country, and these were made up of knights and vassals. Then your yeomen, who were usually in this type of occupation. Peasants and serfs, who could, eventually obtain freedom. And then, although it wasn't real prevalent at the time of the founding of the English colonies in America, there were slaves. And so the Great Chain of Being was a shared understanding that this was the social order that was ordained by God. And so the people adopted an attitude of, you defer to your betters. If you're a yeoman farmer, you defer to a noble. There's no mobility in this where you move up, and of course you're not going to move down, but you're not going to move up. And so this was the social order entrenched in England when they started coming over to the New World. I will put this on the course homepage in important documents, so that will be there for you. You will probably see this on the test, of course, with blanks. So, and you'll just need to know here, gentry, yeoman. But there will be a study guide detailing that. So can I take that down now? Was anybody still writing notes on that? Okay, so where we left off, so we were talking about Jamestown. Sorry, wrong slide. Excuse me for 1 second, guys. Sorry. Okay, can everybody see that? The first we left off and we had mention the significance of 1619 in Jamestown. Can everybody see that right now? And I think I just mentioned the first significant thing about that year was they changed the name from James Fort to Jamestown in 1619. And I believe I also mentioned, I did, yes, that on July 30th, 1619, the first General Assembly of Virginia was formed, the House of Burgesses. And so you have a representative government 12 years after the colony was founded. And representative government is very important to Americans. Two other significant things about 1619 that we want to be aware of. Many new settlers came, and on one ship there were 90 single women in the New World. And several of the men rushed to get a new wife, and they, I believe, had to buy 125 acres in order to also obtain a wife. No, I'm sorry, 125 pounds of tobacco. So that was the way to secure one of the single women that had come over. Because remember, tobacco was the staple crop of Jamestown. And then the fourth significant thing was a ship that came from the Dutch, and they had 20 African slaves. So this is the first time in the North American territory that you have slaves. And so remember, we talked on the very first day about this was a clash of cultures. Native Americans already here, clashing with European explorers and settlers, and now this third culture coming in that will basically, these three cultures will be the kind of the ingredients of this new country that will be formed. Now, the slaves, there were 20 of them, and the primary labor force for the Virginians was the white indentured servants who had come over from England. That was the primary workforce for these elite tobacco planters. And you're going to see in the next 40 years, from about 1620 to 1660, you know, indentured servants could work their way to freedom, right? They usually worked for at least 7 years, but it could be anywhere from 5 to 14 years. And they would work their time period, and then their owner would have to give them their freedom. So in the next generation, from 1620 to 1660, the indentured servants, you know, many of them are going to obtain their freedom. I believe about a third of them died in Virginia. And then a third of them went back to England over this period. And so as the indentured servitude decreases, now with these 20 slaves from Africa coming in 1619, the slave trade will continue. More slaves will be brought over, and slave labor, as the white indentured servants decreases, the African slaves increase, so that by the 1660s, slave labor is the primary labor force in Virginia. And when we get closer to the Revolutionary period, there's going to be a paradox there where the Virginia elites, they maintain slavery, and here's the paradox, so that it will also help the poor whites keep their freedom. So that's the paradox. In Virginia, they had to have slavery in order for freedom to become more available for the poor whites. And so we'll talk more about that as we get closer to the Revolutionary period. But at 1619, this is the first group to come over, but slaves were not the primary labor force in Virginia at that time. And then I think I mentioned, but just in case I didn't, 5 years later, 1624, wrong slide again. 1624, by that time, 14,000 Englishmen had come over. And by 1624, however, many of them died or went back. The population by 1624 was 1,132 people. And also during that time, Virginia moved from being a joint stock company, if you remember, to a royal colony in 1624. And it was ruled by the planter elites. Here's a couple of things that just to maybe, for those of you that weren't here last Tuesday, some of the problems at Jamestown. When it was founded in 1607, many of the colonists were focused on gold. So they really didn't think about planning for food. Many of the men that came over were of the upper class, so they felt like they were above manual labor and farming. They didn't know how to farm since they didn't have to do it in England. In the first 9 months, the colony had dwindled down to 39 people. So John Smith took control at that time and enforced some laws to kind of bring order back to the colony and help them improve. One more thing here about John Smith. He forged a valuable relationship with one of the local Indian leaders and his daughter. So any questions on Jamestown again? Madison, you can share with Jay your notes from Tuesday about some of the other details we didn't mention. And also, Jay, that Tuesday's lecture is on the, well, you don't have access to it, but I can email you a link if you want to watch that lecture and get those notes. And anybody else, any other school, I could send you a link to that lecture right for now if you needed it. All right, let's move on to, now the textbook you're going to see, if you don't have it yet, they have the colonies divided up by region, the Chesapeake Bay area, and then after they mention Jamestown, they go to Maryland, and then they go to New England. We're going to go right now to New England. We're going to kind of go in chronological order of the colonies. So the next colony to be founded, anybody want to guess? Bueller, anybody? Are you guys aware of that cultural reference to Ferris Bueller? Ferris Bueller's probably way too far before your time, 1986. But anybody want to guess what the next colony was after Jamestown? Think New England.
Was it Massachusetts?
You're close.
Plymouth?
Plymouth, yes. Which later, you know, they're all the same state, but Plymouth colony was founded in 1620. Founded by the begins with P.
Oh, was it the Puritans?
Pyramids?
Puritans.
Oh, Puritans. Oh, I'm sorry. No, the Puritans founded Massachusetts in 1630. 1620 was did someone say it? Pilgrims, yes. The Pilgrims founded Plymouth in 1620. Here's the difference between the Pilgrims and the Puritans. The Pilgrims were a group from England and some from Holland, and they wanted to completely separate from the Church of England. So they're sometimes called separatists. They came in 1620. That's where we get our traditional Thanksgiving celebration from. You know, they landed and had good relations with the local Native Americans and celebrated a time of Thanksgiving with all the turkey and mashed potatoes and gravy and stuffing. Y'all are forgetting about my jokes. You can laugh. But anyway, the Puritans came 10 years later, and they founded Massachusetts colony at Boston, and they wanted to just purify the church. That's why they're called Puritans. They didn't want to break away. They wanted to stay in it and purify it from within. So that's the difference between the two groups. But you will want to know and take down in your notes that both groups were coming primarily for religious freedom. The Jamestown colonists were coming primarily for economic reasons. They wanted to improve their situation economically, get their own land. But the two groups in the Massachusetts Bay Area came for religious freedom. Now the Pilgrims Of course, we know that the Pilgrims put together a contractual agreement of government. And can someone tell me what they called that? And here's a hint. It's named after one of their ships.
The Mayflower Compact.
Right, the Mayflower Compact. And if you have your textbook, you'll find some good notes on this on page 54. But all of the colonists on the ship signed it, and that they would abide by the laws made by the leaders of their own choosing. So they would choose the leaders, but then the leaders would govern. So another representative type of government there. And get this back up for you. Now, the way I have the way I want you to remember the colonies is, like I said, the textbook mentions the Chesapeake colonies, which would be Virginia and Maryland. And then you have your middle colonies, New England, and then your southern colonies. But I'm going to go to a description with just 3 names instead of 4, where Virginia and Maryland is in the southern colonies. And we remember that Virginia, when it came to the Confederate War, the War of the Confederacy, they were, or the War of the States, they were in the Confederacy. So, so we have Jamestown down here, 1607. By 1624, they have a representative government. The Plymouth colony, the Pilgrims come ashore, and they have already established the Mayflower Compact in 1620. So the English colonists are coming over, and they're wanting to get away from a country where the monarchy reigns, also though in conjunction with the church, because in England, even though they had thrown off the Catholic Church, they were an Anglican country in which the king was the ruler of the church. And so why were some of those separatists in 1620 coming from Holland? Because they had left England to avoid persecution. Holland was a land of religious freedom, so they escaped persecution. And then when the Pilgrims came over, some of the Englishmen that had been living in Holland came over with them. They were wanting religious freedom. Now, last thing, and we'll call it a day. The Puritans came over in 1630. They also came over for religious freedom, but the government that they set up was very different than the Pilgrims. And here is another irony. They came over because they wanted to get away from a state-controlled church. But they came over to Massachusetts in Boston, and they set up the very same thing. And so if you came to Boston, you might not be a Puritan, but you had to obey the Puritan laws. You had to go to church on Sunday. You had to pay the tithes to the ministers, even if you weren't a member of the Puritan church. And if you expressed any dissenting views, you were fined, maybe harassed, sometimes run out of Massachusetts, sometimes executed. So 2 groups coming to the new land to establish religious freedom, but one group goes right back and establishes a commonwealth in which you must be a Puritan. They did exactly what they were trying to escape, just a different religion. So what we'll do Tuesday is we'll pick up there, talk about some of the dissenters who got kicked out and how it led to the founding of other colonies, okay? Any questions? If anyone wants me to email them the link to last Tuesday's lecture, send me an email, jabings@carlalbert.edu. And that's the initials JA, then BENGS @carlalbert.edu. No questions? All right, have a great weekend, guys. We'll see you Tuesday.